The night air inside Berkeley Castle is thick and sour, the kind of air that seems to cling to the lungs, damp and heavy with stone rot. Beyond the barred door of a lonely chamber, a muffled scream claws its way through the dark. It rises only for a moment before it is swallowed whole by the walls. Those who heard it do not speak of it, because to speak would be treason. Somewhere deeper in the chamber, iron glows with a devil's light. A fire smoulders low, casting shadows that dance against the cold walls. The tool it feeds, long, cruel, and ending in a blunt point, is no weapon of war, no instrument of honor. It is a brand, a poker glowing red, as if it had been plucked straight from hell itself. And the whispers among the guards say this poker is not meant for iron bars or hearthwood, it is meant for flesh. The victim of this obscene preparation is no ordinary man. He was once anointed by holy oil, crowned beneath the arches of Westminster Abbey, called God's chosen before the eyes of England. His name is Edward. Not prisoner Edward, not traitor Edward King Edward. A monarch who once sat in golden halls, who ruled armies, who wore a crown that gleamed beneath torchlight. Now he sits in filth, chained to despair, about to suffer a fate so grotesque that it would echo through centuries as one of history's darkest legends. What kind of world demands a king's death in such a way? Why must the flesh of an anointed ruler be defiled, yet his body left unmarked for all to see? Why would men conspire not only to kill, but to erase the possibility of martyrdom of scars that could prove foul play? It is a punishment designed not just to silence a man, but to humiliate a symbol. It is murder dressed as secrecy, cruelty dressed as necessity. We are left only with the echoes, the terrified scream, the glow of red steel. The knowledge that somewhere in the heart of a medieval castle, men chose to commit an act so vile, so theatrical in its brutality, that it can never truly be forgotten. And so we must ask, how did it come to this? How did a king of England fall so low that his death would be hidden behind barred doors? His agony swallowed by stone walls, his story transformed into whispered legend of fire and flesh. Stay with me, and I will take you there. Back to the beginning. Back to the gilded cage of Edward II, where the first cracks of his fate began to show long before the fire ever burned. Before the darkness of Berkeley Castle there was light. Before the iron chains and whispers of death there was a throne draped in gold and velvet, a world where men bent their knees at the very sight of Edward Plantagenet. He was crowned in 1307, a young king with the weight of England pressed onto his shoulders, and the illusion that divinity itself protected him. The crown was not just metal, it was a shield, a symbol that seemed to say, here is one untouchable beyond the reach of ordinary men. The court of Edward II was a place of dazzling contradictions. On one hand, it glittered with pageantry. Silk banners hung from the rafters, candles bathed halls in a warm golden glow, and musicians filled the chambers with the sweet sound of lutes and harps. Banquets stretched late into the night, roasted swan and venison wine that bled ruby into silver goblets, laughter echoing under vaulted ceilings. For those at the centre, life felt like an eternal festival of privilege and divine favour. And yet beneath the beauty shadows gathered. Edward was not like his father Edward the Hammer of the Scots, a king of iron discipline and ruthless authority. Where the elder Plantagenet commanded fear, Edward II sought companionship, affection, even indulgence. His bond with Piers Gaveston, a man of wit and flamboyance, scandalised the nobility. Gaveston strutted through court as though he were a king himself, mocking powerful lords with cutting nicknames, dazzling Edward with his charm, and receiving lands and titles that made the barons seethe with fury. Still, Edward saw only loyalty, where others saw arrogance. He showered Gaveston with honours, calling him his brother, his companion, his favourite. To the nobles, This favouritism was poison. To Edward, it was comfort. The court became divided on one side, the king and his beloved. On the other, a nobility who muttered over their goblets that the crown was being cheapened by a fool's affection. But in these early days, Edward barely noticed the gathering storm. He still had his Queen Isabella of France, a bride of royal blood whose marriage was meant to bind England and France in alliance. He still had the wealth of the crown, the pomp of ceremony, the sacred aura of divine kingship. When he rode through London, people still cheered. When he sat at table, courtiers still bowed. It was a gilded cage, glittering and fragile. For even as Edward basked in the luxury of kingship, cracks had already begun to spread across the golden surface. Whispers of discontent clung to the corridors, hidden behind polite smiles. Power once thought eternal was already slipping like sand through his fingers. The irony is sharp. A man who seemed to possess everything: a throne, wealth, love, and divine authority, was already sowing the seeds of his ruin. For in medieval courts, envy was never idle, and power was never secure. Every downfall begins with whispers. For Edward II, those whispers took shape in the form of envy, resentment, and humiliation. His gilded cage had already shown cracks, and the first fissures widened with the figure of Piers Gaveston. To Edward, Gaveston was everything witty, daring, loyal, in a court where loyalty was rare. But to the great lords of England, he was a parasite, a man who had climbed above his station by crawling into the king's favour. Gaveston flaunted his ascendancy, shamelessly mocking earls with cruel nicknames, parading through tournaments, dressed like a peacock, dripping in jewels and confidence. Titles and lands poured into his hands, while older battle-hardened nobles were made to feel like servants in their own realm. Such arrogance could not be ignored. When the lords moved against Gaveston, it was not merely political, it was personal, a vendetta disguised as law. Twice they banished him, and twice Edward recalled him. The king's obstinacy made enemies of men who once might have served him faithfully. To them, Edward was no longer a monarch guarding the balance of his realm, but a love-struck fool, willing to jeopardize the kingdom for a single man. Then came disaster not at court, but on the battlefield. In 1314, Edward marched north to crush the Scots, expecting to secure his father's legacy with a glorious victory. Instead, he was met at Bannockburn. What unfolded there was not just defeat, it was humiliation. His armies, larger and richer, collapsed under the cunning of Robert the Bruce. Thousands of Englishmen were slaughtered, and Edward himself barely escaped with his life. The invincible aura of the Plantagenet kings shattered in the mud of Scotland. For his nobles, Bannockburn was proof of what they had long whispered: their king was weak. Worse, he was blind to his own weakness, returning home to lean more heavily on favourites. With Gaveston gone captured and brutally executed by the barons in 1312, Edward turned his heart toward Hugh Despencer and his family. If Gaveston had been a spark, the Despensers were wildfire. Greedy, manipulative, and ruthless, they devoured lands and titles, crushing enemies with royal backing. By now, Edward's court had become a nest of vipers. Barons who once laughed in the king's halls now plotted in shadowed chambers. Even his queen, Isabella of France, felt the sting of betrayal as the Despensers usurped her influence. The smiles at banquets grew thinner, the silence heavier, the tension more brittle with each passing day. The seeds of doom had been planted. In the beginning it was only resentment, only whispers. But resentment in medieval England was never harmless. It grew fed by humiliation and greed, until it became something darker, sharper, deadly. A king once untouchable was now a king surrounded his enemies, multiplying like shadows at dusk. And shadows once gathered always move closer. It is one thing to be hated by your barons. It is another thing entirely to be betrayed by your own blood. For Edward II, the trap that would end his reign was set not by distant enemies, but by the woman who once shared his throne, his bed and his crown, Isabella of France. At first, she had been the dutiful queen, a teenage bride sent from Paris to seal peace between two kingdoms. But Edward's neglect was a wound that never healed. She was forced to watch as Gaveston basked in affections that should have been hers. Then later as the Despensers humiliated her, stripping her of lands and influence. They even denied her the income that was her right as queen. Publicly shamed, privately scorned, Isabella's heart hardened. Her chance for revenge came in 1325, when Edward sent her to France to negotiate peace with her brother, King Charles IV. There, far from the reach of the Despensers, she transformed from a discarded wife into a queen of iron. At her side stood Roger Mortimer, an exiled noble who had once rotted in the Tower of London before escaping to France. Where Edward was weak, Mortimer was ruthless. Where Edward was indecisive, Mortimer was decisive. Together, Isabella and Mortimer were more than allies. They were conspirators, lovers, and the architects of a king's destruction. By 1326, the invasion fleet was ready. Isabella and Mortimer landed in England with only a few hundred soldiers. But they carried something far more powerful than numbers: the support of disaffected nobles and the silent blessing of the people who were weary of Edward's failures and the Despensers' greed. The invasion was less a war than a collapse. The realm that had once bowed to Edward now deserted him. Great lords flocked to Isabella's banner. Towns opened their gates. Soldiers laid down their arms. Edward and Hugh Despenser the Younger fled west, desperate, clinging to the last remnants of power. But desperation is rarely dignified. Hunted like criminals, they moved from abbey to abbey, begging for sanctuary. Their kingly robes reduced to rags, their words of command falling on deaf ears. In November, they were cornered. Despenser was dragged off to face a trial so vicious it was little more than public theatre. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered before cheering crowds. And Edward, the anointed king, son of the Hammer of the Scots, heir of Plantagenet blood, was shackled in chains like a thief. His crown ripped away his dignity, stripped, his fate sealed. The betrayal was complete. Husband undone by wife, king undone by queen. The trap had closed with merciless precision, and Edward II, once wrapped in silk and ceremony, was now little more than a captive, his enemies closing in his future, narrowing to a single suffocating point. Chains are heavier when they carry not only iron, but shame. For Edward II, captivity was not a single moment. It was a slow descent each day, peeling away another fragment of dignity until nothing remained but despair. At first, his imprisonment carried the illusion of mercy. After his capture, he was held at Kenilworth Castle, a fortress of stone and water surrounded by a moat that glistened like a cruel boundary between freedom and exile. There he lived in a twilight of former majesty, still a king in name, but a prisoner in reality. Guards bowed stiffly, but their eyes betrayed contempt. Servants brought food, but whispers followed him with every step. He was no longer Edward the king. He was Edward the failed, Edward the forsaken. Then came the transfer to Berkeley Castle. If Kenilworth was a gilded cage, Berkeley was a dungeon of despair. The chroniclers speak of filth of damp chambers where the air stank of rot and human waste. Some accounts suggest his captors forced him into the foulest rooms deliberately, hoping the stench and the vermin would break him faster than any blade. Once anointed with holy oil, Edward now shared his nights with rats. But worse than the dirt was the silence. Letters from allies never reached him. Appeals to his son, now crowned Edward III, went unanswered. Each attempt at contact was smothered, burned before his eyes. His enemies wanted more than his death. They wanted his isolation, his utter erasure. A man abandoned by friends can still cling to hope, but a man abandoned by his own blood learns what true despair feels like. Imagine the thoughts that must have haunted him in the dark. Memories of his coronation, when golden oil dripped upon his brow, when voices proclaimed him God's chosen. Memories of Gaveston's laughter of feasts and tournaments of a world that had seemed eternal. Now those visions twisted into torment. He had trusted too easily, loved too unwisely, ruled too carelessly. His kingdom had turned to dust in his hands. And in the silence, the knowledge pressed harder than the chains. It was his wife who had betrayed him, his queen who had delivered him into the hands of his killers. There is a cruelty in waiting. Days blurred into nights, weeks into months, each one filled with the dread of footsteps approaching his cell. Each creak of wood, each scrape of metal might herald the end, yet the end never came. His tormentors were in no rush. Death was not to be swift, it was to be slow, gnawing psychological. In Berkeley Castle, Edward lived like a ghost before death ever claimed him. A king in exile from himself, a man hollowed out by fear, stripped of every bond that made life bearable. When he finally died, it would not be the first time he had been broken. It would be the last. A king's crown is never taken lightly. It is not just gold and jewels. It is the embodiment of divine authority, the sacred bond between ruler and God. To strip it away requires more than force. It requires a performance. And so, Edward II's enemies staged their play, a grotesque theatre dressed up as justice. The stage was Parliament, but its chamber was already poisoned. Those who gathered there knew their lines before the curtain even rose. They were not convened to decide Edward's fate, but to announce it. The words were written in whispers long before deposition. Abdication, replacement, the end of a king. They cloaked it in law, pretending that the kingdom demanded order, that the crown itself required a stronger hand. They accused Edward of weakness, of failing to protect England, of lavishing wealth on corrupt favourites. They spoke of his humiliations, the disaster at Bannockburn, the disgrace of the Despensers, the shame he had brought upon the realm. Every wound was paraded in public like evidence in a trial, as if failure were treason, as if misjudgment were a crime punishable by the theft of a crown. But no trial was ever truly given. No honest defence was ever heard. Edward was not permitted to plead his case, to remind his barons of their own betrayals, to name the Queen herself as the architect of his ruin. His voice was smothered before it could rise. Witnesses were chosen not for truth, but for obedience, their silence bought or forced. Even his son, the boy who bore his name, was wielded as a weapon, declared the rightful heir, while the father was cast into shadow. And so the king, once robed in purple and crowned with gold, was forced to abdicate in January 1327. His trembling hand signed away the throne to his son, the child who would be crowned Edward III. Imagine that moment, the parchment spread before him. The ink still wet, the boy waiting beyond the chamber doors. A father made to yield to his son, not out of love, but under the dagger's shadow. The barons called it justice, the chroniclers called it law. But the truth was laid bare in the silence that followed. It was not justice, it was fear. They feared the memory of his crown, the possibility of his return, the dangerous spark of loyalty that might still flicker in the hearts of some. To preserve their power, they smothered him beneath the weight of falsehoods and ritual. It was a farce, a masquerade of legality. And when the crown passed to a boy, when Edward's name was blotted out, there was no triumph, only hypocrisy. For in the hollow victory of Parliament lay the seeds of a darker decision yet to come, that a living king, even dethroned, was still too dangerous to let live. The last day of a man's life rarely announces itself. It begins like any other, with the scrape of a wooden door, the clatter of a dish, the whisper of footsteps in a corridor. But for Edward II, every sound inside Berkeley Castle carried the weight of finality, as if each moment were a drumbeat leading to the inevitable. On that final morning, the air was sharp with the chill of damp stone. His cell was dim, a single slit of a window, letting in a blade of grey light. The food left for him was meagre coarse bread, a piece of salted fish, and a cup of thin ale. Once Edward had dined beneath vaulted ceilings, the fragrance of roasted meats and spiced wine surrounding him. Now he chewed in silence, each bite tasting of ash. Chroniclers tell us nothing certain of his last words, his last thoughts. But imagine the silence in that chamber. Perhaps he whispered prayers, lips trembling against the cold. Perhaps he thought of his son, the boy who now sat on the throne, wearing the crown torn from his father's head. Did he picture the boy's face at his coronation? Did he wonder if the child understood, or if he had already been taught to forget? Perhaps Edward's mind drifted backward further still to the laughter of Piers Gaveston, the banquets of youth, the bright banners of tournaments. Once he had loved, once he had ruled, once he had believed himself secure beneath the mantle of kingship. That mantle had burned away, leaving only chains. Memories must have haunted him, bittersweet phantoms that both comforted and tormented. We can almost see him clutching a small crucifix, the only symbol left to remind him of grace. For a king anointed with holy oil, the greatest fear was not death, but dying without dignity, without the mercy of God's embrace. Alone, abandoned, betrayed, Edward's greatest torment was not the filth of the cell, but the silence of heaven. As the sun sank beyond the Seven Hills, the castle grew quiet. The guard's boots echoed on the stone steps outside his chamber, slower, heavier than usual. Edward would have felt it in his chest, a cold realization settling in. The end was near. No heralds proclaimed it. No bishops announced a sentence. Only the gathering dread of men preparing for something unspeakable. And yet, in those final hours, Edward was still human, fragile, frightened, yearning for life. A king stripped of every title, reduced to a prisoner, yet still breathing, still clinging to the last threads of existence. That is the cruelty of a final sunrise. It forces a man to see what he is about to lose, even as the shadows gather to take it away. Night fell heavy over Berkeley Castle, a suffocating darkness broken only by the dull orange glow of fire in the lower chambers. Somewhere iron hissed as it met flame, its tip reddening, brightening, until it pulsed like the heart of a demon. The conspirators had chosen their weapon not for speed, not for mercy, but for secrecy. Edward II was to die in such a way that no blade, no noose, no wound could betray the crime to the outside world. The door to his cell creaked open, the air shifting as armoured men stepped inside. They carried with them not the instruments of execution. One might expect no axe, no rope, no sword, but a device of cruelty made infamous by whispers, a red-hot poker, its heat shimmering in the shadows. Another guard held a horn, hollowed and cold, meant to silence the king's screams as the act was done. Edward, weakened, rose from his straw bed in terror. Chains rattled as he tried to retreat into the corner, but there was no corner deep enough, no stone wall strong enough to protect him. Rough hands seized him, forcing him down against the foul-smelling rushes. He thrashed, but his body was no longer the body of a warrior. It was the body of a prisoner wasted by months of damp and despair. The poker was raised. Silence fell broken only by the crackle of the fire and Edward's desperate gasps. The method was as cruel as it was calculated to burn the life out of him from within, leaving no mark upon the skin, no scar to betray the crime. The smell came first, acrid, unbearable, the stench of burning flesh mingling with the mould of the dungeon. Then came the sound, muffled and terrible, a scream choked down into the hollow of the horn, a human cry buried before it could escape the castle walls. What Edward felt in those moments can scarcely be imagined. The white-hot invasion of fire, the searing agony ripping through his body, the sheer indignity of dying. Not as a king, but as a spectacle of cruelty. His enemies did not merely want him dead, they wanted him destroyed, humiliated, erased. And then silence. The poker was withdrawn, the horn removed. Edward's body convulsed, then lay still, the glow of the fire now reflected in lifeless eyes. The room stank of smoke and death, yet no outward wound could be seen. To the world outside he would appear untouched, his corpse bearing no trace of the violence that had ended him. It was done. A king had been murdered, not with sword or battle, but with fire and shame. A death so grotesque, so carefully hidden, that it would linger in legend long after the flames had cooled. When the deed was done, Berkeley Castle fell into an eerie quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavier than sound. The guards, who only moments earlier had held down a struggling king, now stood frozen, staring at what they had wrought. The air still smelled of smoke and something far worse, but no one spoke of it. To speak would be to acknowledge, and to acknowledge would be to condemn themselves. Edward's body lay motionless on the straw, pale in the torchlight, his features twisted into the last echo of agony. Yet, strangely, terribly, there was no mark. No blade cut, no rope. Burn, no broken bone visible to the eye. To those who would later see him, he might have appeared to have simply faded, as though death had claimed him gently. That was the horror of it. His torment had been hidden behind, flesh sealed away inside a body left deceptively whole. The conspirators worked quickly. Water was brought to wash him, clean linen to shroud him. The chamber was scrubbed, torches relit, as though order itself could erase what had been done. When word of his death spread, the official account was bland, almost dismissive. The deposed king had died of natural causes, a convenient end to an inconvenient life. But rumours cannot be scrubbed so easily. Servants whispered of muffled screams in the night, of the strange horn carried into his cell, of the acrid stench that no washing could mask. Soon those whispers leaked beyond castle walls, carried by merchants and travellers, until they reached the ears of London. The people who had once cheered Edward's fall now shuddered at the thought of his end. For even a failed king, a weak king, was still an anointed king, and to kill him in secret was to stain not only his memory, but the very soul of England. Isabella and Mortimer declared the matter settled. They presented the corpse with solemn ceremony, displayed it briefly for inspection. No wounds could be seen, and yet the silence of the onlookers was louder than any cry. The people were not deceived. They saw a body, whole, but lifeless, a man gone too soon, too suddenly. And in their hearts, suspicion took root. In that silence, the world felt colder. A king was dead, and no trumpets mourned him. No solemn bells rang through the night. Only whispers remained spreading like a fog across the realm. Berkeley Castle itself seemed to hold its breath, its walls now soaked with a secret no stone could ever fully contain. It is said that the most terrifying moment is not the scream, but what comes after the silence, the emptiness, the realization that what was once alive is now only memory. For Edward II, that silence was his final legacy inside the castle walls. History does not end with a death. It lingers, it festers, it reshapes itself into legend. And Edward II's fate, whether truly sealed by fire and iron or by some quieter cruelty, has haunted England for 7 centuries. The official account was simple, almost too simple. The deposed king died at Berkeley Castle in September of 1327. He was buried with ceremony at Gloucester Abbey, his tomb marked by marble and crowned with effigies. To those who gazed upon the monument, it appeared that order had returned, that the realm had laid a troubled monarch to rest. But beneath, the stone questions stirred. Chroniclers of the age could not resist the darker tale. They wrote of a poker heated until it glowed, of a scream that rattled the castle walls of men so intent on hiding their crime that they chose a method both theatrical and grotesque. To them, the red-hot iron was not merely a rumour, it was a symbol. It embodied the cruelty of politics, the hypocrisy of justice, the desire to erase a king without leaving a mark upon his flesh. And in retelling the story, grew until it became one of the most infamous legends of medieval Europe. Yet not all agreed. Some whispered of another ending, that Edward escaped, smuggled into exile by sympathisers, living out his final days in secrecy on the continent. Letters survive, mysterious, half-believed, claiming sightings of the lost king in Italy, a shadow wandering far from the throne he once wore. Was he truly burned from within at Berkeley, or did he simply vanish into the fog of history, his death rewritten by rumour? The truth may never be known. What is certain is the legacy that followed. Isabella and Mortimer, triumphant in Edward's fall, soon met their own ruin. Edward III, the boy king crowned in his father's place, grew into a man who could not forget the whispers that his sire had been murdered. In 1330, he turned on Mortimer, executing him with brutal swiftness, while Isabella faded into a gilded but powerless retirement. Power, as Edward II had learned, is always borrowed, never owned. And so the story of Edward II remains a caution, a riddle, a warning carved into the fabric of history. Was the poker real, or was it myth, a tale sharpened by those who needed to explain the silence around a king's death? Perhaps it does not matter. For in the end, legend shapes memory more powerfully than truth. What we are left with is a question: when kings can be humiliated, erased and destroyed in darkness, what hope is there for ordinary men? Perhaps the real horror is not the scream in the dungeon, but the silence that follows, a silence that teaches us how fragile power is, how brutal politics can be, and how easily even a crowned head can be consumed by fire.